Here we go, I think. Hi, Rob. Can you hear us all right?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So thank you very much for everybody coming tonight. I have no knowledge about mapping whatsoever, but I'm glad that you guys have come on to learn some stuff from Peter, who is a bit of a whiz on mapping. And this is going to be the first of many. In the current circumstances, we're having to do this via this sort of medium by Zoom or YouTube, but eventually, hopefully, we will be able to get into a physical room when circumstances allow us to do so. So this is basically all about the Consett Steelworks and mapping that site, but that will then also lead into working with other groups. And we've got a couple from Land of Oak, for example, tonight, Rob and Jeff, who've got a mapping group who are already starting to do some work further down the valley. So we'll be able to work together and link in with them and with anybody else as well. And this is basically a chance for everybody to get some hands-on experience and assist with this. Peter will talk a little bit more in a minute, but I think he's been doing this for about 10 years. Has done quite a bit.
And the rest.
But hasn't done it all. So he will welcome anybody's input to fill in the spaces, really. And also to help with looking to get some more detailed ideas of plans for the buildings, photographs, so we can utilise, etc. We can utilise that. So I'm going to hand over to Peter. Anybody who has got the software on, please do play along with Peter. We are recording this, so this will be put back out on the pages and the website, etc. To watch back. So don't worry if you miss something as we go through, because I will know this will be quite a quick breeze through, because there's so much to cover. But
well, to be fair, sorry, Richard, I didn't mean to cut you off. To be fair, I'm quite open to going beyond the hour tonight. So if people are still around, sort of when 8 o'clock comes and we still haven't got through it, and you want to hang on and stick with me, I'm quite happy to.
Okay, well, we'll play it by ear and see how people are and what commitments and so forth. But let's not hold back. I'll hand over to you and let you crack on.
All right. Well, as Richard says, thanks everybody for coming along. For those who don't know who I am, I'm native Consett, like the rest of you. But I was born in Delves in the early 1970s, so I remember what the steelworks used to look like. But unfortunately, I left school just a little bit too late to ever get a job there because they'd closed. But as a teenager, everything that was getting pulled down and all the old then empty railway lines became a really good playground. So I got to exploring a lot of it. And as I got older and I got into IT, and particularly mapping and GIS, I decided it would be fun to try and recreate Consett digitally in a computer. So, as Richard says, for about 10 years now, probably a little bit over, I've been using an old 1970s map to actually rebuild Consett digitally. Now, I'm not going to bring that map up tonight because I've got to go and pull it down off Google and various other bits and pieces. And tonight's session is basically just to get you used to using QGIS and learning sort of how to make these maps and things. But brief introduction. I'm a local IT. I run a local software company called Digital Solutions. Okay, has somebody got a radio or a TV on in the background?
Aye, me.
Yeah, can we mute it, please? Because it's
So the people in the room, I'll have to. I'll tell you what, I'll just watch the recap of it. I've got nowhere private.
No, can you mute your microphone?
Yeah, how do I do that?
Yeah, that's it. Great stuff. Great. That's right. That's great, Dave. No, it's just, as I was just about to say, I actually wear hearing aids because I'm deaf. So this is adapted to fit over my hearing aid, and when there's background noises, it spikes it. So it causes problems with me being able to hear it properly. Right. Anyway, if you want to come and find out more about me, I'm usually on Twitter, I'm usually on LinkedIn, and we'll leave that introduction there for now. So, what are we going to do tonight? Now, I'm assuming or hoping that most of you watched the video I did just a little while ago during the celebrations. And you saw me use a mapping application called Quantum GIS. Now, if you've already read the notes on the Facebook post and you've seen those notes, hopefully you've downloaded this and you've got it on your PC ready to run. And if you have, I encourage you to fire it up, launch it, ready to go and work along with me. If not, don't worry about it. As Richard says, it'll be recorded, so you'll be able to go back and watch through this at your own leisure. Downloading, it's easy. You just go to the download button, run the exe that gets downloaded as you normally would for anything you install off the internet, follow the instructions, and everything should be hunky-dory. If after we finish this session, you then want to go on and explore more about Quantum GIS, I strongly recommend subscribing to this YouTube channel. It's a Norwegian guy called Klaus Carlsen. He's a member of the QGIS development team, and his videos contain just about anything you would ever want to know about the application. Yeah. Now, when you first fire Quantum GIS up, you will probably be greeted with something like this. In my case, I would normally have lists of maps and things in here that I'd already done. It's fairly straightforward. If you're used to using Windows, this is not just a Windows application, by the way. It's available for Macintosh and Linux. So whichever operating system you're on, you'll be able to use it on that. If you're familiar with Windows or most Windows style applications in general, you've got your menu across the top here, and you've got various toolbars with icons on. We'll go through some of them shortly, but generally, this here is your new project. So clicking that will give you a nice, clean, bright white workspace in order to start drawing things in. Now, if you look down at the bottom here, you will see you have a few bits and pieces. You've got your coordinates. Now, by default, they will default to the equator. So if you see I'm sort of -0, it's quite hard to get it spot on, but if we move up into the center of the screen, we should hit about 0, 0, which is basically the center of the equator, where the Greenwich Meridian crosses the equator, somewhere off the coast of South Africa. You have things like your scale, your magnifier, rotation, things like that. This number here is a very, very, very important number. When you're working with maps, particularly maps in a local area, you need to make sure that you have the correct EPSG code. Here in the UK, all of our maps are EPSG 27700. Okay. Now, for those of you who use a mobile phone with a GPS on, you may be used to seeing these latitude, longitude figures. Well, latitude, longitude figures are exactly the same as EPSG 27700 figures, except they're in a different space, if you like. If you imagine taking one space with its X and its Y like that, and then transposing it slightly off, then that's kind of how it works. I'll point you at a resource later on that will help you more with that. I've actually written a book on GIS that you can download for free. I don't have the link to hand, but I'll post it on the Facebook post for those who want to go and download it. That explains all of this EPSG stuff. The point is, though, if you're used to using a phone with your latitude and your longitude, a phone will normally use EPSG WGS 84. Or, as I look on my chart on the wall, 4326. So that 27700 there is the UK one, known as OSGB 36. Your phones will be 4236 or WGS 84. For all of the mapping that we do with the Consett project and all of the mapping that I've done so far, everything is in EPSG 27700. If later on down the line you open a map and you draw something and it doesn't appear where you intend it to or where you believe it should, then it is most likely that you've drawn it using the wrong number. Yeah. So loading it in and setting that number correctly and locating it back to the right space for that number will usually correct that. But again, that'll be a future lesson. What we'll do, we'll cover common errors and things like that, and I'll show you how to correct things. If I hover over that, you'll see that I actually get a little pop-up and it tells me, you see the OSGB 1936, that's where the OSGB 36 comes from. As long as you've got EPSG 27700 selected, you're probably going to be perfectly fine. If you start a new project and you need to change that before you start drawing anything, you can change that by going up to your project menu and going to properties or pressing Ctrl+Shift and P. When the project properties open, you will get a screen like this, and you can see straight away here, these are the two common ones that I use. So you can see by default, mine is set to that 27700 code, but you'll see just above it, I also have that 4326. Notice the red square just below it there. You see how that changed from worldwide to UK? Yeah, because not only does the code tell QGIS where you're drawing, it tells QGIS what the maximum boundary is, if you like. Yeah, so that's UK wide, that's worldwide, right? You can, yes, one more thing. If you tick this box here or don't select a different code, then when you load in files, mapping files, such as shape files, things like that, that are in different codes, it will ask you for the code that they're in. If you actually set a code properly and the code of the file you're loading has a different code, then it'll change that code automatically for you and you won't realize. It'll just magically make it all work together. Apply, okay, and there we go. Right. So, how do we draw things? Okay. There are two different types of graphic that you are going to work with. One is a bitmap, the other is a vector. Now, anybody want to take a guess at what the difference between the two of them are?
Could I just introduce myself, Peter?
Yeah.
I don't normally tell everybody what I do, but I work for HM Land Registry, so obviously I'm sworn by official secrets, but you would absolutely love my job because we have access to the Ordnance Survey.
Yeah, same as I do.
That's what I do. I overlay the databases over the maps, so we can have title plans, we can have Ordnance Survey, all detail. So that's all we do, and we just click and move them across. So I haven't seen what you were doing at the minute, but yes, I know exactly what you're saying when you said vector maps. That's
well, I was basically just putting the general question out there because I like to make these things a bit interactive, you know. But I do a lot of contract work for the Ordnance Survey.
Yeah.
For their database systems. So it's all good fun.
So we could get something, I could get an old map of the steelworks and just overlay it on the top, which is kind of what you're trying to produce.
Yep, this is exactly what I'm doing, and you'll see shortly because I'm going to show the folks here how to pull in some tiles from the National Library of Scotland and start drawing things over the top of the tiles. Yep.
Yep, excellent.
So Okay then, aside from Lisa, does anybody actually know what the difference between a raster and a vector is? Don't be shy, come on, speak up.
A vector is a mathematical formula that you can zoom more or less infinitely, whereas a raster is more or less a fixed image.
Almost. So if you take the example of a vinyl record or a recorded tape cassette or something like that, and a piece of sheet music, they are the audio equivalents, if you like, of raster versus vector. So a raster, like a photograph, is fixed. It is made up of a finite set of pixels, and it can only be displayed the way those pixels say it can be displayed, much like your record or your tape cassette. You can't, for example, play back a tape cassette or an MP3 recording and give it and switch the instruments around to make it sound differently. A vector, as Robert quite rightly points out, is made up of mathematical formulas and numbers and things like that. It's more like a set of instructions on how to draw the graphic rather than how the graphic should be displayed. Now, these two terms, when it comes to mapping, are very, very, very important, because a lot of the time what tends to happen is we use something called base mapping, and the base mapping tends to be raster. And you can't really do much with that raster. You can display it at some different zoom levels and you can trace around it, but a raster is exactly as it looks and it will always look like that. If you've got a very poor quality raster, then there's not really much you can do to improve it, make it sharper, make it better for printing. With a vector image, which is the type of data that is usually produced when you trace round a raster, you can zoom in, because those numbers tell the computer the coordinates where it has to draw those lines, where it has to draw the rectangles and the circles and the polygons and such like. Now, when it comes to QGIS with rasters and vectors, you'll see that we have some tools here. These are your new layer creation tools. This one here is a shapefile layer, and a shapefile is the primary vector format that most GIS applications will use. There are others. If any of you have used Google Earth, for example, and you've drawn something on Google Earth and saved it out as a KML or a KMZ file, a KML and a KMZ is a vector file. But if you take a screenshot of Google Earth and then paste it into a Facebook post, that's a raster file. Along here, we have the data source manager. And if we open that, we see down the side here, we have vectors, rasters. We have lots of others as well: mesh, geopackage, spatial light. I'm not going to go in any depth into any of the others just yet. We're going to be primarily concerned with these two types. So what we'll do is we'll start by creating a new vector file. When we click the vector icon, this little window will open here. And click on the button with 3 dots. I'll just create it on my desktop for now. My first map.shape. And we'll just give it a name. Feel free to pick any name that you want. Geometry is the term for the contents that go into vector files. And in GIS, there is 3 primary types of geometry. There are points, lines, and polygons. Points are exactly as the name suggests, one pair of XY coordinates. Lines, exactly as the name suggests, are a list of points connected by segments of line in between. And polygons are a circular line that encloses the innards of it. A rectangle forming the outline of a building, for example, would typically be a polygon. If you're tracing an old railway line, for example, you would normally do that with a line. And if you are putting a point, say, for example, Dave Jones lived at this house. Sorry, 2 seconds. if you're putting a point somewhere that says Dave Jones lived at this house in 1842, then you would use the point geometry. When you've decided what type of geometry you want to draw, for our purposes, just to get started, we'll do a line. You can also choose to give it additional dimensions. Now, we're not going to at the moment, we're going to leave it on none, but your Z plus M and your M values are actually used for 3D mapping. So if you have some data in your map that tells you what the height of the land is at a given location, Lisa will know what I'm on about when I mention DEMS and digital terrain models, things like that. Sorry. Right, sorry, as I was saying, if you've got, yes, I know it's me mum. Right, after that little interruption, sorry about that, folks. It's one of the side effects of having everything in the house connected via IT. It means that when the phone rings, everything in this office knows about it. Where was it? Yes. So as Lisa will probably know, when I mention digital terrain models, things like that, these have different shades of colours. The rasters, but they have different shades of colours to give you an idea of how high above sea level a particular thing is at that location on the raster. And this is what the Z and the M values are for. If you decide to create your lines or your polygons with Z and M values, you can actually represent them at the correct height above sea level. Again, we're not going to do that just for now. And then the next one down below that is our all-important EPSG number. You can see that that 27700 matches that 27700 down there. Yeah. The rest of it are database fields. Now, we're not going to create any extra database fields or anything with this beginning, but if you were, for example, tracing out the footprints of houses or the footprints of streets, roads, sections of the company, things like that, you might add fields in here so that you can record the name of the part that you're recording. In some of the buildings layers on some of the work that I've already done, for example, I have database fields that I can record the street name, the house number, that kind of thing, so that I can then do a search against that database and find that, look that property up later and match it to other records, things like that. For now, we'll just okay that. And you'll see in this panel to the side, my first map appears. Now this panel here, where your My First Map has appeared, this is called your Layers panel. Any layer of your map will appear in here, whether it's a raster, whether it's a vector, whether it's an online source, whether it's an ordnance survey map, a database, whatever, it doesn't matter. They will all appear in this list at the side. And the order in which they appear in that will be the order that they are stacked on top of each other in the main screen here. So taking Lisa's example from previously, if we had a raster map in here and a database above it that we were drawing into, if the raster was there and the database was there, you would see the raster with what you were drawing on top. If the vector was there or the database was there and the raster layer was above it, you would only see the raster. You wouldn't see the lines or the points or anything like that that you're drawing. So again, this is another thing to watch out for. If you draw something and you can't see what you're drawing, check that you've got things in the right order at this side here. Now, once you've defined a layer, and once you've got it set up to start drawing things, you then need to make your layer editable. You cannot draw in a layer that is not editable. This is by design, so that if you have read-only layers in, such as background mapping that you don't want to change, and that you're tracing over, you don't accidentally damage something that you have loaded in. To make a layer editable, you select it by left clicking on it, and then you go up here to this single pencil icon. Yep. Now you see when I click that, a load of different ones along here highlighted. Yeah, most of these along here are actually my drawing tools, and they will change depending on what you've got loaded in. If you've got a polygon layer, for example, the tools you get along here will be in polygon mode. If you've got lines, they will be set up for line mode. If you've got points, they will be set up for points mode. Because we're set up for lines, we can start a new line here by clicking on the add new line feature, and then you'll see we get like a nice little crosshairs. Now at this point, I'm just going to direct your attention from my screen to this web camera, because if you're going to do this seriously, I don't know how long the cable is on this thing. There we go. If you're going to do this seriously, you really, really, really want to invest in something like this. Yeah, a trackball. The reason being is because when you're moving your mouse cursor around, you're using your thumb on this ball here. And if you lift your thumb off, it stops. It allows very, very accurate positioning right down to a fraction of a millimeter on your computer screen. Now, the problem with using a regular mouse to do this kind of work is what tends to happen if you're moving around trying to connect the dots, so to speak, you take your hand off, particularly if your hand's sweaty or you're a little bit shaky, you might knock your mouse out like that. Yeah. So if you're going to do this seriously, invest in a trackball. It's absolutely essential because you can move it really, really finely. I mean, you can see the small movements I'm making there with that one, you know? It really, really, really does help you get things super accurate. Click and drag, and you'll see that you get your rubber banding. So there's our first line. And then if you right click once you've finished drawing, it will then commit it. Now, in our case, I didn't add any extra features or any extra fields to that database. So the only thing that pops up is this with the default field in. I'm just going to give it an ID of 1. And there we go. That's our first line drawn. And it's really easy. There's nothing to it. You know, you just keep adding more lines to your drawing, right click when you're finished, fill the fields in. If you had put any extra fields into your shapefile before you started drawing, that dialog box that pops up there when you press your right hand key would have presented fields for you to fill those in. So, for example, if you were drawing rectangles for buildings, going back to what I mentioned before, you would have been able to draw a rectangle, press your right hand key, that form would have popped up, then you could have filled in 41 Delves Terrace, whatever, and put whatever data you needed into that field, into that file, into that database. Right. So that's the basics of drawing. Once you've drawn some stuff, you have to commit it to your file. If you don't commit it to your file and you then go and exit QGIS, your changes won't be saved. You'll see just here next to the pencil we used to put it into editing mode that we have Save Layer Edits. Click that. Those 2 lines are now in that file on disk. Yeah, so at this point, I can close QGIS down, I can reload my project back in whenever I'm ready, and those changes will be saved. If you do not save your layer edits, you will lose your work. So get yourself into a good habit of drawing some, save your edits, draw some, save your edits, draw some, save your edits, so on. Yeah. Doing it that way means that if you do accidentally close your app down or if your PC crashes, you don't lose the whole thing. You only lose maybe the last few minutes or so of the work that you've done. something like that. Once you're finished with a layer and you're not going to add any more to it, click your pencil, take it out of editing mode. That locks it so that it can no longer be modified. Yep. Again, it protects the work that you've already done, especially once you start getting to the point where you have several layers in here. Okay. Once you have your project set up, this is your main save icon up here. Clicking that will save the entire project to disk. Not only your shape file, but the actual, come on, what are you doing? Not only your shape file, but your entire setup. It records things like the APSG code you're using, the different shape files that make up that map, any background mapping, anything else extra that you might have included in. A big thing about creating maps and drawing in Quantum GIS is styling. If you double click on a layer, this will appear. Now, at first, it might look a little bit daunting, but you don't need to worry too much. This is just a set of pre-made stuff. Yeah. So for example, if I click that one and click apply, you'll see that the lines that I've drawn take on that style. If you have any styles that you frequently use, for example, because I do a lot of OS stuff, I have some of their coloring. Yikes. Yeah, okay, so obviously I've got my scale a tad on the large side there. We'll just switch it back to that one for now. I actually have styles saved for the Ordnance Survey colouring, such as motorways, primary roads, things like that. And when I'm creating mapping, I can go in and I can just instantly change these colours. It's kind of like a library of stuff that I've done before. Changing the colour by hand is simple. You can go in here, you can change colours, you can change transparency levels so you can see through it, that kind of thing. You can change widths, and you see here your units, millimeters, points, pixels, meters at scale, map units, inches, things like that. So you can pick the right units and the right size and scale and colors for the project that you're doing. Generally, you're either going to want this on map units or meters at scale. Meters at scale particularly will scale up and down depending on how far or how near you are zoomed in on what you're drawing. Yeah. So if you zoom out, your meters at scale will actually shrink down. But if you're zooming in, the line itself will, if that makes sense. Yeah. Whereas map units will fix it at the map units, which if you're using APSG 27700 is nearly always going to be 1 meter. Once you've set yourself up with the colors that you want, apply. Oh, dang it. Done it again, haven't I? Apply and OK it. And if you save your project at that point, those colors and styles will be saved in your project. The wheel on your mouse is you zoom in and out. Wheel it back to zoom out, wheel it in to zoom in. Irrespective of what tool you have selected up here for drawing with or map layer or otherwise, pressing and holding with your right button and dragging will pan, and other tools up here, such as that one, allow you to select things that you've already drawn and perform further operations on them. Everybody okay with those basics?
Okay, yeah.
Yep, excellent. So, you didn't come here to see me waffle on about drawing pretty lines and rectangles and things like that. You came here to find out how to do some interesting mapping. So what we'll do is we'll remove these two lines. Now, unfortunately, hang on. Unfortunately, it's not particularly easy to georeference a map. You can't just pull a map down off a website, load it into QGIS and have it match up all these EPSG coordinates and things like that automatically. You do quite often, unless they've already been georeferenced, have a considerable amount of work to do that. So what I'm going to show you here is how to use the National Library of Scotland. Now, for those of you who don't know and have never been to the National Library of Scotland before, they have this absolutely amazing online map server. And in there are lots of different maps from days gone by right through to fairly recent. And they're all fairly good quality. The problem is they appear in this web viewer. Yeah. And if I was to say, do this and save the image and try and use that within QGIS, it wouldn't do me any good, because loading it in, it doesn't, a normal web image, normal raster, unless it's been specially prepared, does not include information that tells it what the EPSG coordinate is, where in the real world it sits, etc., etc. So I think we're probably, I would say that's probably Bury Edge Road there. So if I was to save that piece of graphic there and then load that into Google Earth, for example, or back into QGIS, it would not line up with any mapping that I had showing where Bury Edge already was. Fortunately, there's a little bit of a hack, a little bit of a cheat that you can use for this. When you've got the thing open in your browser, well, the map open in your browser that you want to work with, all browsers these days, Chrome, Edge, Firefox, all have a special mode called developer mode. It's primarily designed for people like me who are creating websites, things like that, web software. But you can use it yourself to find out some stuff that you need to know about the website. If you press F12 when you're in the page that you want, then something like this will open. Right? Now, these are called your browser developer tools. Now, I'm just going to pin that to the side there and pin that next to it. And what you will see when I move this map, you'll see some entries appear in here. Now that's your browser going out onto the internet and asking the internet and the map server for the graphics for it to draw that map. And if we look closely at some of these, you'll see these ones here have like a cream sort of color that matches what's in the main drawing here. And they have a PNG, and the browser identifies them as PNG. And PNG and JPEG are raster graphics, similar to the same type as we were on about before when I was on about rasters versus vectors. And if we select one of those, we'll see it does indeed show us that little piece of tile. What we're interested in, however, is not the actual graphic itself, but how the browser talks to the National Library of Scotland to ask it for that graphic. And if we go back across to the headers here, it will show us something called the request URL. Yeah. And you'll see here that we have 3 numbers on the end. Now, these 3 numbers on the end are an industry standard set of coordinates for zoom level, X tile, and Y tile. Yeah. And the rest of it is the internet address of the server holding those tiles. If we actually copy this into our clipboard and then go back to Quantum GIS, sorry, too many things open. and then go back to Quantum GIS and switch to our browser tab, we will see an entry here called XYZ tiles. If we expand this and right click and add a new connection, we'll get a window like this open. And you can see in here in the URL, it says, here is an example, Z, X, Y. Now those Z, X and Y parts represent the three numbers that are pointed out in the bit that we just copied from the browser. So if we paste in that line that we got from our browser, and then we replace those three numbers with exactly what the example told us to do. And then we'll give it a name, NLS test 1. You can set some minimum and maximum zoom levels there as well. A lot of the time with sources online like National Library of Scotland, you won't know what they are. So play it safe, 0 to 18. I think the maximum they can go to is about 22 anyway. And you can muck around with the resolution to improve things. Typically with places like the NLS, you won't need any authentication. But if you're using a private tile server, such as one inside your own organization or something like that, you may find that you need to put some authentication or even some basic authentication on. For the NLS stuff, we actually don't need any. So we've specified that, we've given it a name, we'll click OK, and you'll see that this now gets added to our XYZ tiles list here. If I now double click on that, it will ask me how much resolution to our EPSG code do I want to adhere. Accuracy about 1 meter usually. And then it'll tell you it's complete and it's now loading layers. What it's actually doing there now, as you will see, as it's bringing in a layer, it's bringing in that raster layer. Now, in hindsight, what I probably should have done is zoomed into a known location, such as maybe Consett Town Centre or something. Because if you look at my coordinates down here, I'm still down near the equator somewhere. So this map, because it's adhering to this code, will be way off several thousand miles up in this direction somewhere. Let's see if I can zoom to layer. It's doing something. Now, depending on how far out you zoomed or how far in you zoomed, this could take a considerable amount of time. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to save and stop this one. And I'm going to load in one of my recent ones. This one here, I think. Okay, yes, I know that's missing. It's just because there's a file missing there. Now this one, you'll see I was zoomed in on that one when I loaded it. And the reason for that is so that it doesn't have to load too much raster data in. The more of these tiles it has to load in, the longer it will take. Yeah. Obviously I've been doing something over here pathway. So if we zoom out a little bit, you can see it drawing the tiles. Let's get back over towards Consett somewhere. There's Tanfield Lee, Whitley Head, Dipton. Here we go. Oh no, sorry, that's Anfield Plain. There's the Consett to Sunderland there. Ah, there we go. Ah, I've actually been drawing some stuff onto this. So the tiles that I'm using here are not the same set that I just loaded in a moment ago. The tiles I've got loaded in there are actually these ones, the OS 25-inch. There we go. And to save you the task of having to go and do that browser trick to find out where they are, so you can add them to your own QGIS, you're probably going to want to write this down. Yep. That one there is the actual XYZ tile thing, the URL that you need to add to your XYZ tiles in your QGIS browser in order to get the 25-inch Durham map. Yep. I'll leave it there for a minute, a few seconds. That's the name that I've given it. That's the original NLS name, 1982 to 1914. Now, some of the maps that I have are taken from old Ordnance Survey maps that I have a license to use, but I don't have a license to reproduce publicly. So unfortunately, I can't let you have copies of them, which is why we're using the National Library of Scotland stuff. Eventually, I may be able to find a way of using some of them in a closed user group, obviously, when we meet physically to start doing things like this. But for now, the only ones I can tell you that I know you're probably allowed to use will be the National Library of Scotland ones. If you do find a source that's public and can be set up using the XYZ tile method into QGIS, please do let the group know, because the more sources of maps we've got publicly that we can use to draw things from, the more we can create for the good of the community. Right. You can come back and pause this later if you need to see that again. So we'll minimize that back down and we'll get rid of the browser. So right now, you can see I have a couple of different things here. That's missing. That was the one it complained about when it loaded up. If I select my railway, you can see I've got some blue lines here where I've been tracing out the railway tracks. And that was simply just using the line geometry, the one that I showed you at first. So if we were to add a bit to that, for example, we'd pick our railways layer. We'd put it into editing mode, just as I mentioned before. Start a new line, and then from the end of there, we'd simply just trace out the route of that railway line. Now, I'm using my regular mouse here, but as I mentioned before, obviously, if you're going to do a lot of this, you are much better off with a trackpad. If you get to the edge of the screen, hold down your right mouse button. No, sorry, it wasn't the right mouse button, it's the middle mouse button. I screwed that one up. Erase that one from memory, folks. It's the middle mouse button. You used to drag it. Yep. Now, yes, I did not complete that line, and there was a reason I didn't complete that line. You'll see you've got this little magnet symbol up here. Well, this little magnet symbol and these few tools to the right of it, those are your snapping tools. If you've got line work or vectors that you've already created, then what you're probably going to want to do, especially when you're drawing an extension on after them, is making sure that your new lines perfectly line up with the ones that you've already created. And this is where your snapping tool comes in. Now, I've got mine set to 1 meter there at the moment. We'll bring that down a bit to 0.5 meter, 0.5. And we're going to make it active across all layers. And we're going to snap on vertex and segment. Now, what that means is I've got 3 vector layers there and a raster layer. So my snapping would work across all of those layers if there was anything to snap to. Think about going up and down in the stack. Whereas if I have it only on the active layer, it's only going to snap to anything that's on that particular layer. Vertex and segment. Now, if you remember when we drew the lines before, you get this corner here where you put a point. So that's called a vertex. And then this line in between the 2 points is called a segment. Yeah. If you are snapping to vertex and segment, then you will snap anywhere along the course of that line. And indeed, you can see as I move my mouse pointer near to that railway track, I get a little pink marker that shows me that it's going to snap onto that, no matter whereabouts I am on the line. But if I change that to just vertex snapping, you'll see it doesn't go pink as I hover over the line. It will only change to pink. There we go. It will only change to pink when I get to where there's a point in the line, where there's a vertex. Yeah. So for what we're doing here, we're going to extend this track a little bit. So we'll move to the end. There will always be a vertex at the end of a line. And again, we'll just trace up that little bit of line. Now, this is where using your zoom wheel comes in helpful as well. If you've got the ability to zoom in, i.e. your map's got a reasonable enough quality, then you can zoom in and out and actually follow things really quite accurately. So we'll take it to about there and then we'll stop. Ignore that next val thing. It's because I'm saving all of my data into a database and not into a shape file like you guys probably will be when you first start out. Down the line, what I will do with the assistance of Richard is we'll set up a server somewhere with a central database on, so that anybody who takes part in this project and draws anything, all of their work all goes into this one central database, so that if I draw something and you then go and load your map in, what I've drawn will appear on your map and vice versa. We're not at that stage yet, and it's a little bit more complex than just loading in a simple vector file. Again, if I want to add another layer, I can add, say, a polygon layer, for example. Let's zoom in on Sherburn Terrace here. We'll make this one a shape file. We'll make it a polygon. We'll make sure we're on EPSG. And we'll say, we'll call it buildings test. And then when we enable that one for editing, we've also got these tools along here. So if we zoom in, our rectangle tool is particularly helpful. If you're going to load these things into Google Earth or into a modeling package, everything needs to be absolutely perfectly straight. If you're drawing things by hand using lines and drawing the lines bit by bit, it's very likely that you're going to be out, even just out by a fraction of a millimeter can make a lot of difference. So to make things easy, you have a number of predefined shapes. And I find myself personally, one of the most useful tools is the add rectangle from 3 points. So if I select that, for example, and then we zoom in on this building here, right on the edge of Sherburn Terrace. If I click on one corner and I bring that rectangle across to the other corner, you'll see I get a nice, perfectly straight rectangle going down like that. Right click, and it's created. My next one, Now I've got 2 points of reference. Remember the snapping that I mentioned here before? Because I've got 2 points of reference, my next building is going to be perfectly straight next to that one. And I can stretch it out just like that. Right click, fill in my form. And we can keep doing this for different buildings, different shapes. I'm not going to go into editing existing shapes in today's session because we'll be wrapping up shortly, but other tools you have up here, I'll just briefly mention them, such as this one here for reshaping and this one here for splitting parts out of. You use them typically, so you might create a rectangle for the main building, and then you might use the reshape tool to add that little bit onto the end of it. Or if you draw a rectangle big enough to take this whole one in, you then might use the split tool to cut that bit out. Which method you use depends on which is easier for you. I tend to find that it's easier to cut parts out than try and add parts in a lot of the time. But we'll save that kind of editing for a future lesson. The last thing I'm going to show you now is how you can test the line work that you've drawn in QGIS. So if you remember, save, take it out of editing mode. If you right click on something that you create, you will see that you have an export function down here. Okay. And if we go to save features as, we'll get a save box. Now this will save only that layer. And it doesn't matter whether that layer is in a database or whether it is a shape file or whatever it is, it will save only that layer and only the way you specify it. So you'll see I've got something called keyhole markup language selected here. KML, or keyhole markup language to use its full name, is the file format that Google Earth uses. So if we just go and save this on my desktop, my first map buildings.kml, and make sure that you change your EPSG code. Google Earth only obeys the latitude longitude EPGS code, the WGS84 one that I mentioned back at the beginning. So in order to push it out to Google Earth and make it appear properly in Google Earth, you always need to switch it to WGS84 before you save it. You can set other things up here. We don't want to load it back in. You can set it to use the colors that you've set, various other bits and pieces. It's all advanced stuff. We're not going to bother with that right now. We're just going to OK that. And you'll see that it's exported. If I now fire up Google Earth, apologies, I should probably have had this loaded already, but I didn't think that far ahead. No, top monitor, please. Thank you. So if we just zoom in on Consett there. And there, loaded in, if anybody was watching my posts in the Facebook group yesterday, when I did the outline of the park to answer one of the questions, there's the outline of the park that I did, still loaded in, Fawcett Park. But for what we're doing here, you save your file as a KML, and you'll have this file on your desktop or wherever you've saved it. If I click on that, that will actually load into Google Earth, and you can visually look at it to see whether it's landed in the correct place. And you can see indeed it has. Those three buildings that we drew on the end of Sherburn Terrace there have appeared correctly on the end of Sherburn Terrace. So using Google Earth in this way and using KML is a great way to check that what you've drawn makes sense and it appears roughly where you expect it to appear in the real world. Yeah. Now, obviously, if you're drawing things for the steelworks and stuff like that, stuff that might not be there any longer, you obviously don't have a frame of reference. There is no buildings there to check them against. So you might have a hard time. With Google Earth, actually, we're pretty spoilt for our area, because if you click on this little thing up here, we can actually go all the way back to 1945. And the mapping may not be of good quality, but if you're doing parts of the steelworks and that, it does give you a small frame of reference. There's the original Berry Edge Road going down to the Grove, for example, down through the heaps. And you can actually step back wherever there is times that Google have thought to go and photograph our town. The more into the modern era you get, you know, the more you get, the more you see it change, and the more steps there are. So if you are doing parts of the steelworks or anything like that, you can use the 1954 stuff as a kind of frame of reference. But ultimately, as long as this appears roughly where you expect it to do, you're probably getting it right. Now, one thing I will caution you against, if you're drawing things like this, do not be tempted to try and use Google Map to draw them. You can see there that those rectangles appear not to be lined up with the buildings, when in actual fact they are. The reason they appear not to be lined up with the buildings is because the satellites that photograph all of this stuff don't photograph it straight down. They're not looking down at a 90-degree angle to the top of the building. They're sort of off at a slope like that or like that. So what you tend to get, you can see here, for example, we can see a little bit of the front of the building, but over the back, all we get is a shadow. Yeah. So the reason these buildings look as though they're out of alignment is not because they are out of alignment. It's because of the angle that the satellite was at when it photographed. Now, if you're lucky, sometimes you might get areas where, given the time of day that it was photographed, you're quite flat on. I think, for example, the Demi. No, the Demi looks as though it's early morning. No, late afternoon, mid-evening, mid-afternoon, for example, because the shadow's that way. There are some buildings roundabout. I can't remember which ones, but there are some areas where Google have stitched the map together and you can get a good idea. But in general, don't be tempted to use Google Maps to draw this imagery or to draw things that to contribute to the project, because you will not make a good job of them. And that's largely about it for now, I think. What I would encourage you to do now is to go away and plug some National Library of Scotland tiles into your copy of QGIS and just have a little practice. Draw a few maps, find some interesting imagery that you would like to trace around, trace it into some shape files and start practicing. You only get good at doing this type of stuff with practice. As they say, practice makes perfect. Yeah. In future lessons, we'll go into some of the tools more in depth. We'll go into things like reshaping, georeferencing. I'll explain how to take a non-referenced map, for example, and match it up to real world points, that kind of thing. And eventually, I will hopefully be able I hopefully will be able to give you all access to this map. This is my main one, my 1970s one that I'm recreating and have been working on for roughly the past 10 years or so. You can see I've pretty much got most of the steelworks already done. Obviously, and I'm sure Lisa knows what I'm on about here, I don't have a license to publish this old mapping that's in the background. There is Ordnance Survey copyright, or Crown copyright, one of the two. I think it's a Crown copyright one, that. And since it's the actually, I might have a license for it. Lisa, do you know what the copyright term is?
I
on
don't,
Crown?
because like I say, where we work, we have copyright to use Ordnance Survey, but we can't provide maps for anybody. So obviously I can't tell you, I can't explain what I do or let you see what I work on or anything.
Yeah, I get that.
But I just
No,
know the Ordnance Survey you have to get copyright from them, and we don't have copyright. What you can do for land registry, you can order a title plan for my house, for instance, and that's open register. You pay a fee for it. Anybody can. But what you're trying to do, we don't provide a service for that. So it would be absolutely excellent. The tools you're using, we have a much sophisticated version of that. And if I was
you'll be using
mapping,
ArcGIS, will you?
I don't know what it's called, but it's obviously, you know, for our works purposes.
Yeah.
We do exactly what the tools you've been explaining there. And if we were going to map a property that came in to be registered, for example, and like what you've said, you might do next time, we might have almost a hand-drawn map that somebody lodges as title to the house, and we have all those tools, and it's very complicated, and we do that, but we don't provide a service like you're doing. So this is why yours has taken so long. I could look at work and put the steelworks over the top of a plan, but we don't provide a service to give that to anybody. So we only use it for individual properties. But yes, the copyright thing, it's such a shame.
Yeah. We can look at that, and also Alan Godfrey might be able to help us from Alan Godfrey Maps as well.
I think I'll probably have to go and look this up to be 100% sure, but I think Crown copyright is 50 years from the date of the first publish. And if this is a 1970s map, then my thinking is this actual background map I'm using here is either has either just come out of copyright or is very close to doing so.
I think once it passes out of Crown copyright, if it's handed over to the National Library of Scotland, that's a good indicator. However, the National Library of Scotland, they contract out a lot of their digitisation, and that is also covered by a separate copyright.
Right.
The sort of work that you're doing, Peter, where the digitiser takes copyright of the digital copy.
Right.
So you can use them because some of them are on a common copyright, common user license. Well,
to wrap up anyway, this 1970s background map that I'm using here, this old one that I'm tracing around, I licensed that from the Ordnance Survey some years ago. I've had this map now for longer than I can remember, actually. It's probably a good 10, 11 years old. So I'm going to look into that one. As far as I know right now, I cannot give out copies of this background map. I can, however, give you copies of the vector artwork that I've done above it, because that is classed as my own derivative work from it. So obviously that will get put into a database at some stage for people to continue to contribute to. But I just sort of brought this up to close the session off, to let you have a look at the work that I myself personally have done to date. And I don't know if I've already put a link on the Facebook group somewhere, but I actually have uploaded some of this map to Google Earth. Just the vector stuff, obviously, not the background stuff. So the railways, the company outlines, the building outlines, that kind of thing. So at some point I'll put that up there as well.
Yeah, we might just set up a mapping group at some point, so that it's not going to get lost, is it? If we put it on the whole group, it'll gradually get lost with all the posts that go on there.
Well, I am, as Richard will tell you, I haven't released it to the public yet, but I'm actually building a web-based, browser-based map thing that you will be able to browse around all of this on, which is not Google Earth, nothing like that. It's my own mapping software that I'm writing. But that's a long way off even being considered finished yet. It's just an early sort of prototype experiment at the moment. It does work quite well, though. I believe you've actually had a play around with it, Richard.
Yeah, it does work. Yeah. Thank you, Peter. Are you all right? If anybody asks any questions, or so, how does everybody feel? Any questions initially?
That's went quite well, Richard.
So it's now just to practice it, and hopefully we can do another session sort of end of next month if Peter's available.
Yep, something like that.
Yep.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Anybody got any questions for me while I'm here?
No, I just say thank you very much for doing it.
For now, it's all been very useful.
Just quickly, Peter,
Mm-hmm.
can outlines of all buildings, or sorry, current buildings that we have at a farm place and put them onto a map now?
Yes, you can, but to take a picture or a map that you already have requires it to be geo-referenced, and that's something that's quite complex to do. You can't just drop that picture into QGIS. Well, you can, and you can draw onto it in QGIS, and it's a great way of practicing if that's what you want to do. But what you draw will not be in the correct place for it to be in the real world once we start putting it onto proper real world mapping such as Google Earth.
Right.
Yeah, not without doing extra work to match all the points up anyway.
We'll cover that in another session, Ian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, referencing it. So.
Just give me 1 second.
So thank you all for coming. If you need to,
1 second,
family time or whatever, appreciate you coming.
1 second, 1 second. So if you fire up your browser and go to my blog, I'll put it in here in big text so that you can see it.
Second.
At that address there. I love watching people typing like that, you know, it's great. Whenever I get the chance to see people who are watching my sessions see them through their cameras, and you see them there, and it's like, get the tongue at the right angle, you know.
Oh,
twist it just a bit to the length.
I've mucked that up already.
Well, Richard's still recording, so you can go back and have a look. But if you go to that address in my blog, you will find this page called My Writings. To date, I've written 8 books for these guys, this company called Syncfusion. But the one I want to direct your attention to is one of the first ones, or in fact, the first one that I wrote, this one, which is all about GIS. And it explains about things like your EPSG codes and different coordinate sets and how they map to the Earth and things like that. It is designed to be read by a software developer. It is aimed at software developers, but there is still a lot of theory in there which will help you understand a lot of this mapping stuff. Yeah. The only thing that Syncfusion asks for is an email address, because obviously, hey, they want to build up a marketing list. Now, between you and me, if you go and use a fake email generator or something like that, that's got nothing to do with me. You know? But you can click on that. You can click on that and it will take you to their website, which is apparently no longer available. Huh, okay. Yikes.
I
Unless
was
the
about to say, would you be prepared for Rob and Jeff to pass it on to their team? They've got a group.
Right,
who
well,
look at mapping.
give me a second, because obviously something's changed here.
Yeah.
Learning and support, ebooks. Okay, the ebook portal appears to be broken for them. I have no idea why. I guess I shall have to drop them an email and find out.
Yeah, if you could do that for me. And would you be okay for Landabout to use that in their mapping group?
What, the GIS book?
Yeah.
Well, I've written it and produced it for Sync Fusion, so I don't hold the copyright on it anymore.
Right. Okay.
All they stipulate is that the book is available free, but you must go and get it from their server and give them an email address. Now,
Right.
if Jeff was to download it and then copy it to the people within his group without Sync Fusion or myself or anybody knowing, again, I know nothing of that. Yeah.
Sorry, Peter.
Members
So-
the whole,
could do the same
it all
thing.
froze there.
You know, so basically what you don't ask me, I have no comment on.
Fair comment.
Agreed?
I wrote that out as well. That's right.
Right.
In fact, I've probably got a copy of this on disk somewhere. I'll reach out to them. I'll find out what's going on first.
Yeah.
I'll see if it's just something broken or not.
Right. Just keep-
If they've took it down or if they've stopped doing the books or something like that, then I'll see if I can find a copy that I'll have around somewhere, and I'll find a way to get it to people. If you do get a copy from me like that, though, it is an unofficial copy and it's not to be distributed outside your respective groups.
Fine.
Okay. Thanks a lot for that, Peter. Jeff and myself are both working on the Land of Oak and Iron project for mapping. I think it may be useful, not for this meeting because I don't want to get bogged down in it, but we've got quite a few vector files that we've created for the whole of the Land of Oak and Iron. So that's extending from Bladen right through to Consett and beyond out towards Blanchland.
Right.
They are not to the same level of detail, and we're focusing on particular aspects, but perhaps at some point we could talk to you about those.
Absolutely.
And pulling them into GIS. One of the things would be georeferencing. So this has been very useful for me to understand. I'm not familiar with GIS, but I'm familiar with CAD and things like that.
Well, to be fair, if you're familiar with CAD and if you have a budget, then I would highly recommend that you take a look at Autodesk Map 3D.
Right, we don't have any budget. That's the big problem.
Fair enough. If you had, however, Map 3D is actually a perfect program, and the reason being is it does everything that QGIS does, but it works exactly the same way as Autodesk CAD does.
Yeah.
In fact, it's based on the Autodesk.
Are we talking thousands for that, Peter?
Last time I looked for a license, it was 4,000 a year for a 25-seat license.
Yeah.
Ouch.
As I say, I won't bog it down and talk to you about it now, but perhaps separately we could talk and I'll explain the route that we have gone through, which is basically using open source software.
Well, he's my decree to people of the community. For the price of a pint and a seat up in Wetherspoons, I will sit and talk to you for as long as you want to sit and talk to me.
There you go.
There you go. I can't say
Right.
I can't say fairer than that. And if not Wetherspoons, the Grey Horse.
Right.
Nice.
Yeah. Rob, basically, it's all about working together.
It is, definitely.
And
Absolutely.
I'm delighted that Peter's so enthusiastic and wants to work with the community. And as far as I'm concerned, that means Land of Oak as well, or any other interested party. That
Absolutely. I wholly agree with this.
and it's just that we share everything together, really.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, one person's work makes it easier for the many. In a small nutshell, that's the way I've always seen it, and it's the way I'll always continue to see it.
So I'm glad that you're already starting to talk, and I would encourage you to carry on doing that. That's what the whole point of this is. We all work together and share our skill and our knowledge.
And another good thing as well, I'm finding in COVID times, unfortunately, it's where we are at the moment, and there's not jolly much we can do about that. But having community get-togethers online like this and doing things like this is really beneficial, not just for the purposes of us putting them together, but it's good for mental health as well. It's good to show people that other people are still there and that the community is still outside your little bubble, if you like, you know?
Yeah, so thank you, Rob and Jeff, and hopefully this is just a good example of how we can start to work together going forward, really.
Yeah.
Right, well, on that note.
Well, thank you for coming, all of you. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you've got any further questions, then feel free to fire it up on the group or whatever, and we'll get that to Peter. Even if he isn't on Facebook, I can get the information to him.
Well, and any of you who drop me a friend request, and once you've dropped me a friend request, you'll then be able to get me via Messenger. As I say, I don't do Facebook in real time. I check it a few times a week. So if you do leave a message on Messenger, don't be offended if it takes me a couple of days to reply to you. But as soon as I realise it's there, I will reply to it, you know, eventually anyway.
So